All right, should we talk about some music?
Yeah.
All right. I am Vincenzo da Brescia in the society. Mundanely, I am Vince Conaway. I am a hammered dulcimer player specializing in, surprise, 16th century instrumental music. I am kind of a fan. I have to say it's a genre that really delights me. And there's a lot more than most people think of there being. It's the very beginning of the heyday of music publishing. And so we have this flourishing of sources, for example, that makes it a really fun and frankly, simple area to study, because we have this wealth of source material that even 40 years prior in time just didn't exist, or at least didn't survive. And so it's one of my personal delights, the fact that we have all of this music from a time period when I like the style of music they were playing. I have to admit that 14th and 15th century music are not to my taste. 11th, 12th, and 13th delight me. 14th and 15th do some odd things. And in the 16th century, I personally is where my passion really hits home. But enough about me. Let's talk about the music. So, instrumental music in the 16th century is an interesting phenomenon because prior in the Middle Ages, instrumental music was a fairly neglected art form. It wasn't really considered an art form. Instruments were either for accompanying singers, replacing singers, or playing for dancers. And that was pretty much it for a long time, plus ceremonial occasions. So fanfares, big public civic events, and that did continue through the 16th century. But in the 16th century, musical instruments became a lot more flexible and a lot more powerful and a lot more accepted, because through a lot of the Middle Ages, you also had this discrimination against instrumental music from the early church, where instrumental music had been seen as a pagan phenomenon, and so therefore a sign of idolatry, almost a sign of lack of faith, of poorly demonstrating one's faith was to play instrumental music, especially if you played a hymn instrumentally, because the music was supposed to be beside the point. The beauty was supposed to be the lyrics that brought you closer to God. So if I do find myself in hell, it might be the fact that I played 13th century hymns instrumentally that puts, well, at least the theologians of the time have their say.
The canticas of Santa Maria show quite a lot of instrumental performers.
They do, but it's all accompaniment, at least theoretically. The problem is it's really difficult in the sources to find out whether people are saying don't play instruments in church because A, they thought it was a bad idea and heretical, or B, because people are always playing instruments in church. You don't yell at people for doing things that they don't do. So in some ways, perversely, people saying don't do X is a really good evidence that other people were doing X. Which is really fun reading music theoretical works, because a lot of times they're very prescriptive in saying don't do Y. And yes, that might be poor period technique, but the fact that they're saying not to do it could be read as an indicator of it being a period technique. Anyway, I love cross-reading sources. It's one of the things that fascinates me about what we do. So once you get into the 16th century, as I said, suddenly the world of instrumental music really opens up at the same time that the world of music publishing opens up. And so suddenly there is this flourishing. And the third factor in there is the fact that there is also this humanist ideal. I don't like the R word, Renaissance, unless we're talking about the rediscovery of perspective in the visual arts. Renaissance isn't really a thing. But if we're talking about humanist philosophy, the idea that a person should be proficient in music was an important part. And so the fact that you have all of this music being published at the same time that this philosophical foundation is telling people you ought to be able to play music, means that people were buying it. It means that there was this huge market for the music at the same time people were able to create it, which means from our perspective, a lot of these sources survive. If you print 500 or 1,000 copies of a book, the odds are, not always, but the odds are 1 or 2 copies survive and come down to the present day. There are still a number of books that we don't, that have not survived, or at least we have not found. And so it's always a frustrating gap, but they are fairly small gaps in what we have. So as I said earlier, one of the big uses of instrumental music through the Middle Ages and into the 16th century is for ceremonial music, for people who are playing fanfares, for big civic events and big religious festivals. The fact that medieval trumpet players carried extensions for their trumpets so they can play in tune with the local organs of the various cities on their circuit, says some really interesting things about these traveling bands of trumpet players and the way that they interacted with civic and ecclesiastical authorities, because they were playing with the organs, because they had to modify their instruments, because you're not changing the tune that organ's in. And there were no such things as pitch standards. And so you do have this tradition of the traveling musicians, and we have this beautiful 16th century invention that made those obsolete, and that invention was the trombone. And I will talk about that in a little bit. The French called it a sackbut, but it's a trombone. My Italophile nature might show through here and there. And so the fact that you have the loud instruments have a place in ceremonial life, have a place in warfare, of course, the drums and fifes and similar instruments of war are also, of course, an important use of music. But the other side that really comes into its own in the 16th century is informal private music making. The idea that people would either have a professional musician to entertain them if they were the highest of the high class, or that they were playing instruments among themselves to entertain each other. And there are a number of really interesting social concepts that come into play. For example, if you were an aristocrat, if you were the upper crust, performing in public was a big no-no, but performing for your peers showed your own personal accomplishment and worth. As I said, in the 16th century, the ability to understand and play music became very socially recognized as an ideal. And so playing in a small group of people, playing for each other, was very much encouraged in the social climate of the time. And then the ways that that happened took a number of different forms. Musical forms in the 16th century start to split off in ways that are distinct from their medieval antecedents. The one that really was popular through the Middle Ages, has been popular through history, is still popular now if you listen to Kenny G, is the fact that instrumental music can be used to play a vocal line. So you can have an instrumental version of a vocal tune, what we might consider muzak. But it was a very popular thing all through the Middle Ages and into the 16th century. It is the simplest form of music to make, because the vocal music, the vocal repertoire, whether it's folk music, whether it's art music, whether it's traditional, in whatever form it is, it's fairly easy to duplicate a melody line instrumentally, and has been done so throughout history. Of course, as I said earlier, the big difference in the 16th century from a lot of earlier time periods is suddenly we have the printing press. And once you have a market, you want to be able to satisfy that demand, and you want to drum up demand. So a lot of the vocal music that was printed in the 16th century has written specifically, you can sing this in 4-part harmony, or you can get a band together and play it instrumentally. They wanted to broaden as much as possible the potential market for the music. And it also does show that this is very much a popular thing that was being done at the time, that instrumental versions of vocal music are very much a thing in the 16th century. Another variation on that is an instrumental setting of an existing music, where you're not just duplicating it, but you are arranging the music specifically for the instrumentation you have. So it's not just a matter of saying, oh, look, we've taken this vocal music and we're playing on instruments. It's, we've taken this vocal music and either written new parts for more instruments. For example, we have a 4-part harmony line, but we have 6 different instruments in the band. So then we'll write more parts to expand the arrangement. And the most common way that you tended to find this, heretically enough, was in liturgical chant, because they started to, as I said, became less frowned upon to have instruments in church. And so you found these arrangements of music to complement a choir. You would have the addition of musical instruments to complement but not overwhelm a choir, which is a tricky thing to acoustically balance. But it was a very popular thing in the 16th century in order to bring the popular music of the day into the church and therefore shake up a little more of the stolid traditionalism, especially when it came to the Protestant Reformation, when people wanted to say, we need to separate ourselves from our Catholic past. So we're going to put more popular forms of music into the church liturgy. Another very popular form of instrumental music, and there are 7 of these that I have listed, and there is some overlap within them, but the third one are variation sets, where you have a couple of pieces that are meant to fit together, that are meant to flow together, one piece to the next piece. This is a huge deal in later classical music. Classical music took this idea and ran with it. You may be familiar, of course, with the toccata and fugue in D minor, reportedly by Bach, although there's controversy there. But the toccata and fugue was one of those settings where a lot of times you would write 2 pieces of music that complemented each other that were set to flow one into the other. Now, a lot of these types were built on but were built on dance forms. However, the music was not meant to be danced. A big one that you find a lot in period printed manuals are dance sets. And these are popular throughout into the 18th century, where you have, for example, Bach is writing suites that go from a prelude into a sarabande, into a bourrée, into an allemande, and finishing with a jig. And these various dance sets are not danceable, but they are using the forms and the steps and the rhythms that the dancers would use if it were an actual dance. The reason I say it's not danceable is because it's hard to find the downbeat when you have a lot of the very ornamented and embellished melody lines that you end up to show off what a virtuoso player you are. But one of the big ones of these, for example, and I'll talk about this a little later as well, is the pavane into a galliard. And the pavane is a very stately, processional kind of dance. And a galliard is a very athletic and exuberant dance. And so it was a very popular technique to take a similar theme in the same key and do a very stately 4/4 time piece that segued into a very upbeat and quick 3/4 piece, which was the pavane into the galliard. And the fact that you could take something that was a theme, that was a very basic melody, and you could write it in different times was really powerful when you could put together these various sets of music. They weren't all dance sets, it's just that the dance sets tended to be easiest and best known among the ways that they would build the set out of individual pieces. The 4th one is my personal favorite, and it is the fantasia. It is not a fantasia, no matter what Disney might say. And the thing about a fantasia is it's a fantasy. There are no rules. There are no hard strictures. You do things that sound cool. It is a fantasy. And so throughout the Middle Ages, everything was very prescriptive. Everything in music theory was very set, very formal, and very structured. And in the 16th century, that started to break down. And the fantasia is one of the forms that did it. The fantasia grew out of the prelude. which is itself a different form. But the point of a prelude was just to be a short piece to set the idea, to set the mode, to set the rhythm of the piece that would follow. And the fantasia just takes that idea of something whimsical, lighthearted, and makes it a little longer, makes it a little, I wouldn't say more structured, but a little more patterned. For example, the biggest characteristic of a fantasia is a thematic motif, if you will. For example, Beethoven's famous dun 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 is a very simple elaboration on this idea, where you have a theme of just a couple notes or maybe a couple measures, and you put it in different places in the key, you run up and down scales, you put it in different parts of the song, and it makes things tie together much nicer. And a lot of times you end up with this very complex form of imitation. As you do something, do it in variation, do it in another variation, and return to the original. Just as a side note, while the Italians had the fantasia and everyone else took the fantasy off of that title, another Italian synonym was a ricercare, which just means to search. And I find that personally poetic. There is no difference between a ricercare and a fantasia. As a matter of fact, we have various individual pieces that, depending on your source, are labeled a ricercare in one source and a fantasia in another source, and they are an identical piece of music. It's just a different name for the same thing. And as a language geek, I find it really interesting that there's a form of music called to search, whereas the popular musicians of the Middle Ages, the troubadours, are named for the French languis and languedoc word for to find. So musicians are searchers and finders, and I am a huge dork for knowing that.
Would you be willing to spell out ricercare?
Absolutely. So the modern spelling is Ricere. And I have to specify the modern spelling because with anything in the 16th century, we have a bunch of different surviving ways to spell it. As a matter of fact, I have an album that will be coming out whenever gigs are happening again, that I specifically do 4 16th century ricercari where each composer spelled it a different way. Just because I really was amused at the idea of having across the back cover 4 things that are the same title, but with a very subtle spelling variations, whether it's Recher, Rice. Yeah, there's some really fun things that they did. But of course, Shakespeare spelled his name 4 different ways in the 9 signatures that we have. So it's rather entertaining. And the more that you deal with primary sources, the worse your spelling gets.
What do you play them on, Vincenzo?
I am a hammered dulcimer player as my primary instrument.
Okay. Interesting.
It is my baby. It's been good to me. And the modern dulcimer has a similar range to a 15th through 18th century lute. And so a lot of the music that was composed for lute will translate fairly readily. And I find that a lot of fun and really powerful. Of course, with 2 hammers, it's hard to duplicate 4-part polyphony. But when I can find something with 2 parts, which was a big fashion at both the very beginning and the very end of the 16th century, I can really go to town.
Vicine. Yeah.
So another very popular form was the canzona. And again, there is a lot of overlap between these various forms. And a canzona is an arrangement of a secular song. And the reason it picked up the Italian name canzona is most of them started life as a French chanson. And most of them were keyboard arrangements where they took a lot of this vocal or vocal plus instrument music and they translated it to keyboard, because in the late 15th and through the 16th century, keyboard instruments are doing some really neat things. With the development of the virginal, the spinet, and the harpsichord, you are suddenly getting these very powerful instruments that have 4, 5, even up almost 6 octaves in range, which gives you a huge breadth of notes that you couldn't have otherwise, that previously they hadn't had in a single instrument. Plus the fact that keyboard instruments have the ability with multiple fingers to do fairly chunky, big chords. They don't all sound great on a harpsichord. You have to kind of roll them, because if you do a big chunky chord, it just goes kind of clunk. But you had the incredible addition of the 16th century keyboard instruments, which really broadened the repertoire, made it a lot easier to do some really fancy things with a solo instrument. Because of course bands are a different thing and have been a different thing through history. But the popularity of keyboard music, and then with the polyphonic finger-picking style on the lute, was another big advancement that gave people a lot more flexibility. In the Middle Ages, lutes were strummed with a pick, which means there are only so many things you can do. But when you are finger-picking, suddenly you have the ability to pick out a lot of different, more complicated harmonies. So after canzone, I mentioned earlier the prelude, which is an improvisational style piece. Of course, later in the 16th century, they are less and less improvised as music becomes more and more fancy. It's really hard to improvise a 4-part harmony. Although people could do it, and they tended to get really, really famous in their time period for being able to. But the prelude was generally just a short piece of music. The point is that it's setting the key and it's setting the time for the longer, more formal piece to follow. And this again is something that will maintain its popularity through the 18th century. The prelude just is a way to whet your appetite, as well as being a bit of a finger exercise, just something to loosen you up, to limber you up as a musician before you got into the meat of the piece. Now, the ricercare and fantasie came from the prelude, but so did the toccata. And the toccata is a form that starts to catch on at the very middle to tail end of the 16th century. And the toccata is a little bit different than a fantasia because it is a little more formal. But it does come from that same tradition of a brief, simple, improvised, imitative bit of music. And of course, again, the prelude was also popular in liturgical music, where it got your choir to know what key you're in. So rather than having a pitch pipe and having everyone hum the first chord, which is the way a lot of modern choirs do it, if you have a 15-second piece of music on the organ, then the choir already knows the key. They just jump right in and go from there. And then finally, of course, for instrumental music is always dance music. Dance music has been incredibly important from an instrumental perspective throughout history. As I mentioned earlier, not all of the dances that were written and published in the 16th century were actually meant to be danced, especially as the dance music became more and more artistically showing off. The more virtuosic it gets, the less intentional it was for an actual dancer to use it. A dancer needs certain things like a clear downbeat. And you can have a lot of fun by omitting the downbeat and playing around it, just using the same time signature, the same tempo, and the same chord patterns as you would use for the dance. But it makes it very difficult to actually dance. And so we have a lot of art music that duplicates folk music, but is not actually danceable. But then, of course, there also was dance music that was meant to be danced. Dancing is a hugely popular recreational activity in our time period. Our earliest dance manuals, Donato Urbo with the orchesography, being, of course, one of the most prominent and best known of the 16th century dance works, and one of the earliest to, in a survivable, recognizable way, bring a lot of the dance steps down to us. But the fact that dance music was this huge opportunity for musicians was also really important to make jobs for musicians. And I will be talking about jobs in a few minutes. But yes, the fact that dancing was hugely important and recreational in a time period before recorded music means that if you're dancing, you need a band, or at least a single instrumentalist, preferably several, someone to keep the beat and someone to keep the melody. So the next point about music in the 16th century is, how are they playing it? What instruments are they using and how are they putting them together? And first I'm going to talk about bands. You have the consort. And there are two types of consort in the 16th century, in 16th century England especially. You have the whole consort, W-H-O-L-E. And the thing about a whole consort is that it's just varying versions of the same instrument. The most popular one that we tend to see the most, at least on the east side of the Mississippi River in the society, is the recorder consort. And so you'll have people with 4 or 6 different sizes of recorders: soprano, tenor, alto, and bass. And you'll have 4-part recorder harmonies. Another very, very popular version in the 16th century was the viol, or the viola consort, where you have the viola da gamba and the viola da braccio, and you'll have varying sizes of viols. However, viols are really expensive, so we don't see quite as many of those in the society, especially not for people who like each other and want to play together and have complementary sizes of viols. So it was a very popular thing in period that sadly we don't see a lot of now. However, it was a very important part of the musical tradition of the time. The recorder, of course, wasn't the only wind instrument. Recorders are very nice and mellow and quiet, and it was very popular, especially for civic ceremonies and religious celebrations, to have shawms and bombards. And if you want to know what that sounds like, think Wolgamut. Wolgamut does a really good job of demonstrating. They do it in a broken consort. They do it using several different instruments, but they're complementary instruments, the way that they have the German bagpipes, the shawms, and the bombards, that it gives you a very good idea of what it would sound like to listen to an entire band of nothing but shawms, bombards, or period pipes. And my favorite of the 16th century consorts, whole consorts at least, is the trombones. If you want to go back in time and make a really good living as a musician, learn to play the trombone. The trombone was a really, really, really powerful instrument because, first of all, it has no defined pitch scale. Because it's a sliding scale, much like the violin, you just put the note where it goes. And so they could play with any other instruments because they could adapt their pitches to organs, they could adapt their pitches to trumpeters, they could adapt their pitches to a tromba marina. Whatever instruments they are playing with, they can adapt to because they are not on a strict pitch standard. And the trombone is a very new and therefore fashionable instrument in the 16th century. And they're kind of hard. Trombone is not an easy skill. And so because it was a very specialized skill, it was a very new instrument. And because trombonists were fairly good at organizing themselves into guilds, the trombone players were the highest paid musicians, at least in the court of King Henry VIII, where we have fairly detailed records for who was getting paid what in the court. And the fact that you had trombone consorts that were specialists in being able to play improvisatory 4-part harmonies together as a musician just blows my mind. The fact that you could have a group of people who knew the music, knew each other, and knew the forms well enough to be able to just off the cuff improvise 4-part harmony just blows me away. Now, I dropped the other sort of consort in there earlier. The opposite of a whole consort is a broken consort, and that is basically a pickup band. A broken consort is what we tend to see most in the society, where we've got these instruments and we're going to play them together because they work well together, or at least they don't step on each other too much. You don't want to play a violin with a bagpipe, for example. Or maybe you do. If you're a violin player who's not really confident about your skill level, totally play next to a bagpiper. No one will ever know. But the broken consort is basically just starts as a pickup band, as, hey, we have these instruments, let's play this music. Of course, over time, and as things became a little more structured and a little more formal, there are certain forms of a broken consort that became very popular because they worked especially well together. So for example, you found a lot of flute and viol ensembles. You found a lot of lute and keyboard, a lot of lute and harpsichord duos and consorts. And you found various other combinations. We have a 16th century English composer who composed for the cittern and viol, which is basically a similar sound as a modern mandolin with a modern viola, is probably the best way to explain what that would sound like. And I'm not sure if it was popular, but it is something that Anthony Holborn wrote a number of pieces for. And then my favorite of the broken consorts, you have the Elizabethan Exquisite Six. Now the Exquisite Six got its name because there was a pickup band playing and Queen Elizabeth walked into the room and she said, "Oh, that is exquisite." And so the band marketed the bejesus out of that, and suddenly composers are printing all this music for this specific broken consort as proclaimed by the Queen, and it became a really fashionable thing for a while. And that was a consort of a cittern, which is like a mandolin, a lute, two viols, usually treble and bass, a recorder or a flute, things can be flexible, but some sort of soft wind instrument, and a bandora, which is basically a bass lute. And so there are a number of composers in Elizabethan England in a 20-year period were suddenly just going crazy with this particular consort because Queen Elizabeth was a pretty good marketing term. And of course, as I said earlier, printing business was a business, and anything that they could do to broaden their horizons was helpful. So of course, other than consorts, you have solo instruments, and there were a couple instruments that were particularly popular for solo musician. For example, most of the recorder music that we have was music for a consort, because the time period, the fashions of the 16th century meant you wanted a little more complicated harmonies. And it's really hard to do complicated harmonies with a single melody line instrument. So there isn't a lot of wind instrument solo repertoire, for example. But the lute was really powerful. As I said earlier, once you went to finger picking from a medieval strumming technique, the lute became a very powerful, very popular instrument for the polyphonic and harmonic music of the time period. And so you found a lot of lute music being published, an overwhelming amount of lute music being published in the 16th century. Conveniently, the lute was the same tuning as the viol. And so every one of those lute books says, also playable on a viol. Now the viol, as a bowed instrument, didn't have the same amount of flexibility as the finger-picking style of a lute. But since the intervals between the strings were equivalent, you could technically play, at least with a minimal amount of alteration, a lot of lute music. So it was a very common marketing term to say, book for lute and also viol. But it was popular, and it was possible, although it wasn't nearly as easy is the wrong word, because some of this is stinking hard lute music, but wasn't as readily converted. You had to make occasional sacrifices on a lute, for example. If you were playing strings that weren't next to each other, it can't really do that with a bow. So I mentioned earlier, the keyboard instruments of the time period were extraordinarily powerful as they grew to larger and grander scales, where suddenly, rather than the fairly limited 2 or 3 octaves you had in many instruments in the past, suddenly you have 5 octaves or even more. And we have a fair amount of keyboard music that comes down to us either in manuscript form or in printed version. The problem with keyboard music from a printing perspective is that keyboard music was really hard to print. Lute music and viol music, and along with the other instruments I'm about to talk about, were almost all printed in tablature form. Now, if you're familiar with modern guitar tab, tablature is a way of basically just saying you fret this string at this point and then play it. And so, for example, modern guitar tab is, you see a 0, you play an open string. You see a 1, it's the first fret. 2 is the second fret. 3 is the third fret, yada, yada, yada. And tablature is still a very, very common form, especially on the internet, where you can make tablature very simple using ASCII characters, rather than trying to do music notation in the mid-90s when we were in the true dark ages of technology. And so tablature is a very simple way to express what to play. It's fairly easy to read, and it's a lot easier to print. There are a couple different ways that printing technology worked with music in our time period, but movable type and printing presses did some weird things, and it required a little bit of some fancy workarounds to get it all together. And tablature printed fairly easily. So between the fact that it was fairly easy to print by comparison and the fact that it was fairly easy to play by comparison means that we have a lot of tablature. Whether it's tablature for the lute, tablature for the viol, or some of the other solo instruments we have, there was a big flourishing in the late 16th century of music for cittern, which I mentioned earlier is similar to a modern mandolin. And the cittern music was very popular in France, in Italy, and in England. And also was almost always published in tablature form. In Spain, you had vihuela music. Luckily, the vihuela was tuned in the same way as a lute at this time period. So once again, people in the 16th century would publish a book of vihuela music, also for lute, also for viol. But the other one I'm going to talk about is an instrument that we only have a little bit of music for because it wasn't popular long enough, or it wasn't popular enough for long enough for them to print a lot of books. And the 16th century guitarn is basically a baritone ukulele. So if you ever see someone playing a baritone ukulele, it's a very similar to a 16th century guitarn. And sadly, we don't have a lot of guitarn music. Only 1 or 2 books with music for it were published. It was exclusively an English instrument. And we have little snippets and scraps in manuscript form, but not a whole lot. Just enough to know that it was indeed a thing. Now, speaking of tablature, there are 3 different forms of tablature that were most common. Most of them give modern guitar players a little bit of a twitch in some way or another. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the tablature we know is 0, 1, 2, 3 up the fretboard. In the 16th century, French and English tablature didn't use numbers, they used letters. So it's A, B, C, D, where A is an open string, B is the first fret, C is the third fret, D is the fourth fret, so on and so forth. Happily, for a modern guitar player or a modern musician used to tablature, the order of the strings on the page is the same. So if you're reading 16th century French or English tablature, the top string is the high note. The bottom string is the bass string. However, in Italy, they reversed it just to keep everything and everyone on their toes, keep everything interesting. So the top string is your bass and the bottom string is your treble. And as a personal problem, drives me crazy. So So Italian tablature looks like modern, what we think of as guitar tablature, because it uses numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, but the order of the strings is reversed. Spanish tablature is where we get modern guitar tablature, the guitar having been a Spanish instrument first. And so the fact that, that Spanish tablature took the numbers from Italian tablature with the orders of French tablature and gave us what we know as guitar tablature today. So the last thing, second to last thing, a couple things. So 16th century, of course, is 100 years. That's a little bit of time. And so making generalizations across an entire century is a little bit fraught. There were some changes that happened. The biggest change is at the beginning of the 16th century, music was a lot more improvisatory. Things were a lot more improvised, and the ability to play off the cuff was very prized. Towards the end of the 16th century, the composer became more important than the musician. And so the composition, the underlying composition, became a bigger deal than your ability to wing it. And so by the end of the 16th century, there was a lot less improvisation and a lot more stick to the text and the ability to sight read. Just as a personal quirky thing regarding a change in the 16th century, the beginning of the 16th century, a minstrel is a traveling musician. At the end of the 16th century, a minstrel is a beggar who should be out working but isn't. A sturdy beggar, someone who could hold a job but isn't because they're a lazy drain on society. When King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and the Protestant Reformation, that just happened to dissolve the social safety net, and suddenly there were a lot more beggars on the street. And so the idea of a traveling musician playing for tips becomes a big social no-no, as suddenly the streets are flooded with traveling beggars. Oops. So speaking of beggars, that brings me to jobs. How did musicians get paid? And there are a lot of different ways that, that musicians earned a living in the time period as instrumentalists. And the big one is, of course, patronage. You got a job playing music at events. As I said, trombone players had a huge lock on this, but you also find it for other musicians. The other side of that is a lot of the times, much as musicians today tend to be, music teachers. So a lot of times you will find someone hired to perform music for a household who is also there to tutor the children in music. Additionally, musicians were hired for whatever. They might have been there to play music under the for the boss, under the auspices of their patron. However, they might be hired for a lot of different things, especially since musicians tended to be a fairly trusted servant. A lot of times they acted as an agent for their employer, for their patron, whether it was a land agent or as a acting in some capacity on their behalf. Another way that musicians made a living, of course, is in the publishing industry. I've talked a lot about printing. However, copyright in the 16th century rests with the person who prints it, not with the person who writes it. And so the person who prints the book makes all the money off the book. The composer might have put 2 years into this book and they are not going to make any money for it, except that on the front page of the book, a lot of times they will say, "This book is dedicated to Lord Burleigh, who is a brilliant musician and a delightful human being." And Lord Burleigh will often say, "Oh, nice, here's £5," which apparently was the going rate for a dedication. So the fact that musicians would go to a lot of effort, most of the music publication on the part of a composer was to enhance your reputation. So you could get better gigs as a performer and as an instructor. The actual money goes to the printer. Now, of course, when you do say Lord Burleigh is a brilliant musician, the reason Lord Burleigh gives you money is because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, in the 16th century, we have this idea that music is a skill that people are supposed to have, but it's not a skill they're supposed to show off in public. And so if you say, I have sat down in intimate concerts with Lord Burleigh hundreds of times and he is a brilliant musician, then you are also tacitly saying, look, this guy knows what he's doing, and you can tell that I know what I'm saying because of the music in the book. So that is my class. Does anyone have any questions? Excellent. I must have done a pretty good job.
I had the vihuela described to me when I was taking guitar lessons that it existed partially because of racism and the Inquisition, because of the lute's Middle Eastern origin, and they needed a European instrument that played the exact same way as the lute.
Absolutely, yeah. That is, and then they simplified things a little bit and went to a single string, and it evolved into the guitar. But yeah, that's a whole nother topic. It's hilarious to see the way that they improvise their way around some of the things that, some of the strictures, and the Inquisition especially. Yeah, you'll notice that the Spanish Renaissance lasts for about 30 years between when everyone ran out of Rome before the Inquisition started to kill artists.
Yep.
Yikes.
Yeah, there's this heyday of incredible music, especially instrumental music, as I mentioned, was heretical in certain parts of the church. And so in Spain, after 1561, it goes away. Because you only have to kill a couple musicians before the rest of them go, never mind.
Dang. So it sounds like in some places the norm shifted to love instrumental music, and in a few places the norm started to shift and then got iced very effectively. Yes,
and the Council of Trent had a similar effect in parts of Italy, depending on how observant various areas were. The Council of Trent, of course, being the Counter-Reformation, the Catholics' answer to the Protestant Reformation. And one of the things of the Council of Trent was the idea that art was supposed to convey faith, which is one reason why after 1575, all the paintings of the goddess are suddenly the painting of the saint. You know, of course, we had lots of saint pictures beforehand, but a lot of the mythological subjects took a little bit of a break in the late 16th century. And you have the same thing with music, where you have a little less secular and instrumental music. But again, a lot of places in Italy weren't necessarily all that observant. And in Spain, they would track you down for whatever you were doing in your own home. In Italy, you were allowed to do whatever you wanted to do in your own home, generally, with some exceptions. But if you did it in public, you got in trouble. There were a couple of artists, for example, who were very valued for painting mythological themes for private patrons, who got into a lot of trouble. Titian is the one I'm thinking of in particular. When he wanted to do public artworks on a mythological basis, suddenly people who already had commissioned him, cardinals who owned his paintings, were condemning his works because you weren't supposed to do that in public.
That is a strange kind of don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, very much so, to use a modern
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, Vincenzo, do you notice, or if, I'm not sure if it's really even a thing, but I'm more familiar with like early medieval notation where it's very, well, to me, it's hard to read. Like it's very different from our modern notation. Do you see it more becoming standardized in later centuries and like more of a thing that you actually need to read this and not just be able to play by ear because of like the class thing and nobility being expected to do this more?
Yes, absolutely. And also one of the things that is important in this evolution is in the 16th century, people are selling sheet music. In the Middle Ages, sheet music is a mnemonic device because musicians were an apprentice master system. So a sheet music, if you're looking at neumes especially, a lot of it is just a reminder of music that you've already been taught. You're not expected to look at a sheet of neumes and just know how the music goes. You're supposed to have learned it by your masters, and the neumes are your cheat sheet. So the ligatures especially, where it's like, oh, it does this squiggle up and it kind of holds this bit. You're expected to have learned that already, and it's just your reminder. It's in the 16th century and earlier with Guido d'Arezzo and the formalization in the 14th century. Music starts to get more and more formalized in its notation systems. But yes, in the 16th century, musica ficta is no longer a thing nearly as predominantly, for example, where even if you can make out what the neumes are saying, you're supposed to know, oh, if it shows you a tritone, that means you're supposed to do a sharp here, and various other mnemonics on the fact that you're supposed to be able to improvise your way around this simple mnemonic. So yeah, in the 16th century, especially with tablature, where it's saying, look, you press this string at this point, you hold it this long. It's really, really straightforward.
I like describing tab as a recipe where regular sheet music describes the sound.
That's a really good way to put it. Yeah, I would say that's a really good metaphor. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, this is what goes in versus this is what comes out.
But it's incredibly specific as to the instrument.
It is, and that makes it a little tricky. And it's really fun to see people transcribing from one instrument to another. For example, several Cittern books have transcriptions of John Dowland's lute music, which are simplifications because the playing style of the instruments are very different. But it is really interesting to look at the source and see what they did with it to take it somewhere else. But yeah, if you want to change instruments with tab, that's a royal pain. Well, it looks like we are running out of time, but thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your attention. And please stay safe and take care of yourselves.